One decision separated 1 billion people who got rich from 1 billion who didn't, and nobody ever told you what it was. In 1980, India's per capita income was $582. China's was $307. India was nearly twice as rich. Same neighbourhood, same population size, same century of colonial humiliation and famine. India had the head start. And over the next 4 decades, China's per capita income surged 82 times. India's went up 17. Today, China's economy is 5 times larger. The gap between these two countries is the single biggest divergence in modern economic history, and the standard explanation, the one you've probably heard, is wrong. You've been told it's about corruption or democracy or culture or education, and those things matter, but they skip the actual mechanism. They skip the machine underneath. Because when you open it up, when you look at how growth actually gets transmitted from policy to paychecks, you find something specific, something mechanical, a set of incentives wired into local government that China built and India never did. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You start to understand why two countries with almost identical starting conditions ended up on different planets. So here's what you think you know. You think China grew because it opened up its economy and let capitalism in. That's true. You think India grew slower because it kept its economy closed too long. Also true. India didn't liberalise until 1991, over a decade after China, and when it did, it wasn't by choice. By June 1991, India had exhausted its foreign exchange reserves. The country was days from defaulting on its sovereign debt. And in a move that was kept completely secret during a general election, the government airlifted gold to the Bank of England and the Union Bank of Switzerland, just to raise emergency cash. A bullion van rolled through the streets of Mumbai toward the airport, flanked by a security convoy. At one point, the van had to stop because of a suspected tyre burst on one of the escort cars. Inside wasn't a prisoner, it was the country's gold reserves, packed and insured on a Sunday because someone suddenly realised the insurance coverage needed checking. When the news eventually went public, it triggered a political firestorm. But it also triggered reform. The rupee was devalued, tariffs came down, the economy opened, and India started growing. So both countries liberalised, both opened their doors to foreign capital, both had enormous labour pools. And yet by 2002, China was pulling in $52.7 billion in foreign direct investment. India got $4.67 billion, a 10-to-1 gap, same reforms, same pitch to global investors, wildly different results. Here's where the standard story breaks down. Liberalisation was necessary. But it wasn't sufficient, because the thing that actually determines whether foreign money flows in, whether factories get built, whether workers get trained, whether technology transfers, is something much more granular than national policy. It's what happens at the local level, at the level of the mayor, the deputy mayor, the bureaucrat who stamps the permit. And in China, starting in the late 1980s, something happened to those bureaucrats that never happened in India. China's Communist Party runs a body called the Central Organisation Department. Think of it as the HR department for every government official in the country. In 1988, that department institutionalised a system for evaluating every local official. Those officials are called cadres, career civil servants, whose entire professional life the party controls. And the evaluations worked like this. Work achievements counted for more than 60% of a cadre's score. And the single most important metric inside that 60% was GDP growth. Let me put that more plainly. If you were a city official in China, your entire career, your promotion, your transfer to a better post, your shot at the next level depended on one number. How fast your local economy grew compared to the official next door. GDP growth became what's called a veto target, meaning if you missed it, nothing else you did counted. You could run a clean administration, build parks, reduce crime, didn't matter. Miss your GDP number and your career stalled. This created something economists call tournament competition. Every local government was racing against every other local government, and the prize was a promotion, but there was a second engine running alongside the career ladder: money. Chinese cities could sell land use rights. And those land sales became a massive revenue stream for local budgets. So you had officials who were personally incentivized to grow their economy for career advancement, and financially incentivized to attract development because land transactions funded their government. Two gears spinning in the same direction. So what did local officials do? They competed for investment. They rolled out the red carpet for anyone bringing capital. Raghuram Rajan, who served as India's central bank governor, and before that as chief economist at the IMF, tells a story about an Indian businessman who wanted to invest in a mid-sized Chinese city. He flew in and was met at the airport by the deputy mayor. That same day, he was driven to visit a possible factory site, then taken straight to the mayor's office, where all the necessary paperwork had already been filled out. A government representative resolved every concern he raised on the spot. Now think about what's happening here. A city official is spending his personal time escorting a foreign investor around town. Why? Because landing that investment is how he gets promoted. His career is tied to that factory being built. And the proof this worked at scale isn't theoretical. In 1989, foreign companies accounted for less than 9% of Chinese exports. By 2002, they accounted for half. In mobile phone manufacturing, foreign affiliates produced 96% of China's exports. In electronic circuits, 91%. This wasn't China producing things on its own. This was China importing the entire production system, the knowledge, the training, the supply chains, from foreign companies who were welcomed in by local officials whose careers depended on it. Look at what happened with Tesla in Shanghai. The local government offered favourable conditions, including corporate income tax benefits, government-backed loans, and land use rights. And here's the thing that broke China's own rules. This was the first time the government allowed a foreign automaker to wholly own its factory. No joint venture required. They changed the rule for one investor in one city to make one local government's GDP numbers look better. Construction broke ground in early 2019. Cars rolled off the line in late 2019, less than a year. The same company's factory near Reno, Nevada took twice as long. The question is why India never built anything like that system, and the answer starts in 1950, before China's reforms, before liberalisation, with a deliberate architectural choice. India's founders, when they designed the new democracy, made that choice on purpose. They kept power centralised, they kept local governments weak, and given what they were facing, a newly independent country fractured by caste, language and religion, this made some sense. They feared that caste-captured local bodies would abuse power, so they hollowed out local authority deliberately. The political scientist Devesh Kapoor has measured the result. In the early 90s, India's government employment as a share of population was significantly lower than global and regional averages. India's police forces, its judges, its tax bureaucracy, all among the smallest in the G20. The Indian state wasn't bloated, it was starved. And the officials it did have faced completely different incentives than their Chinese counterparts. In China, you got promoted for GDP growth. In parts of India, you got elected for something else entirely. Take Bihar, one of India's poorest states. Lalu Prasad Yadav rose to power by mobilising lower caste voters who'd been shut out by an upper caste bureaucracy for decades. And when he took office and realised that same bureaucracy wouldn't cooperate with him, he started gutting it. Positions went unfilled. When he couldn't find lower caste candidates, jobs stayed vacant. Government recruitment data shows critical shortfalls in teacher hiring. The pupil-to-teacher ratio, already critically high against national standards, worsened further. One teacher for every 100 or more kids. And he kept winning elections, because for the communities he represented, the symbolic act of an upper caste bureaucracy being cut down to size mattered more than what it delivered. Researchers have called this democracy without development, dignity without schools. So that's the Indian side of the incentive gap. Chinese officials who didn't deliver growth got passed over, Indian officials who didn't deliver services got re-elected, and the consequences compound. Because here's what FDI actually does when it works. It doesn't just bring money, it brings knowledge. Workers trained in a foreign-owned factory learn quality control, logistics, precision manufacturing. Then some of those workers leave and start their own companies. Local suppliers develop to serve the foreign factories. The knowledge spreads. That's how an economy climbs the value chain. And it requires a government that will move fast, clear obstacles, and keep the infrastructure running. India tried a version of this. The government leaned on public sector banks, which control 70% of all lending, to fund massive steel, power and infrastructure projects. The project reports painted a rosy picture. The banks lent, and then the borrowers couldn't pay it back. By October 2017, total stressed loans in India's public sector banks hit $145.6 billion. 12.6% of all loans. Just 12 companies were responsible for a quarter of all bad debt. And it got worse. The RBI, India's central bank, had actually been letting banks hide these losses for years through a regulatory loophole called forbearance, introduced in 2008. Banks were allowed to restructure loans without classifying them as non-performing. So they did. They kept rolling over bad debt, issuing new loans to cover old ones, an accounting trick called evergreening. The regulator that was supposed to catch this was complicit in hiding it. When Rajan became RBI governor in 2013, he ordered an asset quality review. Banks had to open their books and classify their actual bad loans honestly. The numbers that surfaced were staggering. The government eventually had to inject 3 trillion rupees, about $42 billion, into public sector banks just to keep them solvent. That's 2% of India's entire GDP, spent cleaning up a mess the system had been designed to ignore. Rajan, by the way, had a track record for seeing what others wouldn't. In 2005, at the Federal Reserve's Jackson Hole Conference, an event that had turned into a tribute to departing Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan, Rajan delivered a paper warning that the financial system was taking on dangerous levels of risk, with Greenspan sitting in the audience. Larry Summers stood up and called him a Luddite. 3 years later, the global financial system collapsed exactly as Rajan had described. He sees the gears. And what he sees in India is a vicious cycle. Government schools face severe challenges, with absenteeism and teaching quality issues documented across multiple studies. So poor families pay hundreds of rupees a month for private schools, rather than send their kids to the free government school across the street. And here's the trap. As wealthier families exit the public system, they stop demanding it improve. They stop pushing for tax increases to fund it. The schools get worse, more people leave, the cycle deepens, and each year it deepens. It widens the gap between the workforce India has and the workforce a foreign investor needs. So what happened to China's miracle machine? Because it broke too. The same incentive system that turned local officials into growth engines also turned them into data fabricators. By the late 90s, the distortions were visible. Officials manipulated GDP numbers before they even reached the National Statistics Bureau. In multiple regions, local officials reported industrial output figures that were later found to be significantly overstated by national audits. In 2017, the governor of Liaoning province publicly admitted his government had been falsifying economic data. Inner Mongolia's figures were audited and found to be substantially inflated. Tianjin's Binhai district made major GDP revisions downward in a single correction, eliminating an amount roughly equivalent to a small country's entire economy. When national inspectors examined companies with suspicious data, a clear pattern of fabrication emerged. Among investment projects, the fraud rate was extremely high. And the debt. Economist Michael Pettis, who teaches finance at Peking University and spent decades on Wall Street before moving to Beijing, describes China's model as one where artificially low interest rates transferred between 5 and 7% of GDP every year from household savers to borrowers, mostly state enterprises and real estate developers. China's debt to GDP ratio roughly tripled between 2008 and 2020, one of the fastest run-ups any large economy has ever recorded. And a rising share of that debt is funding apartments nobody lives in and infrastructure nobody uses. That fueled investment reaching over 40% of GDP, double the global average. It produced growth. It also produced a debt load the country is still working through. And China knows this. Under Xi Jinping, the government has abandoned what he calls GDP heroism. The cadre evaluation system now emphasises anti-corruption, environmental targets, party loyalty. Local officials describe their new reality as striking the bell every day like a monk, passively carrying out duties with no individual incentive to chase growth. The engine that built modern China has been switched off, on purpose. India, meanwhile, is slowly, unevenly building something. The banking system's stressed asset levels have declined significantly from their 2017 peak. A new insolvency code has reduced average resolution times. Apple and Samsung are building factories. The China Plus One supply chain strategy is real, even if it's arriving selectively. India's FDI has been growing. None of this closes a 40-year gap, but it's the first time India has built pieces of the machine that China had in 1988. And that framing, the machine, is what this whole story actually reveals. Growth doesn't come from having the right national policy. It comes from a chain of incentives that connects the person sitting in the mayor's office to the factory being built down the road. China built that chain and it worked spectacularly until the chain itself became the problem. India never built it, and the reasons India never built it weren't accidental. They were designed into the system by people who had different legitimate fears. You can liberalise an economy, you can open borders to capital, you can print brochures for foreign investors, but if the official who stamps the permit has no career reason to stamp it fast, if the teacher who doesn't show up faces no consequence, if the banker who hides a bad loan gets the same bonus as the one who doesn't, then the policy never reaches the ground. It stays on paper, a reform that never touches the street. India was richer than China in 1980. A bullion van crept through Mumbai carrying the country's gold to a foreign bank just to keep the lights on. The gold was later repaid, but the question it should have forced, the question about why a richer country fell behind a poorer one, took another 30 years to even ask. The answer was never corruption. It was never culture. It was always the wiring. Who gets promoted and for what?